Part two, border as wall or border as method. Brown's interpretation of the phenomenon of border walls has been highly influential, at least among liberal academic circles. But it has also been, as should be expected, the subject of several very interesting critiques. Unquestionably, among the most nuanced and insightful of these is an argument advanced by Sandro Mazzadra and Brett Nielsen in their 2013 book titled Border as Method, or the Multiplication of Labor. Mazzadra and Nielsen contend that the image of the border as a wall or as a device that serves first and foremost to exclude is misleading in the end. Indeed, they insist to isolate a single function of the border does not allow us to grasp the flexibility of this institution, nor does it facilitate an understanding of the diffusion of practices and techniques of border control within territorially bounded spaces of citizenship and their associated labor markets. For Mazzadra and Nielsen, then, it is important to look beyond the border's function of exclusion to cast a critical gaze at its role in processes of inclusion as well. Here they caution against the trend in most accounts that treat inclusion as an unalloyed social good and emphasize instead how, as devices of inclusion, borders function to select and filter people and different forms of circulation in ways no less violent than those deployed in exclusionary measures. They set out to show how borders establish multiple points of control along key lines and geographies of wealth and power, and they conceptualize inclusion as existing in a continuum with exclusion, rather than in opposition to it. Doing so allows them to focus on the hierarchizing and stratifying capacity of borders and to examine their articulation to capital and political power, whether they coincide with the territorial limits of states or exist within or beyond them. But how exactly does this argument relate to Brown's? Mazzadra and Nielsen certainly acknowledge the force of Brown's main point that the proliferation of walls and barriers in the contemporary world is more a symptom of the crisis and transformation of state sovereignty than a sign of its reaffirmation. They especially appreciate her thesis that even the most physically intimidating of these new walls serves to regulate rather than exclude legal and illegal migrant labor, producing a zone of indistinction between law and non-law of which flexible production has need. Nonetheless, they insist that their argument goes beyond Brown's by considering how borders regulate and structure the relations between capital, labor, law, subjects, and political power, even in instances where they are not lined by walls or other fortifications. In a word, Mazzadra and Nielsen would have us separate the border from the wall, because only by so doing can we come to see how the regulatory functions and symbolic power of the border test the barrier between sovereignty and more flexible forms of global governance in ways that provide a prism through which to track the transformations of capital and the struggles that mount within and against them. Mazzadra and Nielsen thus urge us to go beyond the focus on borders as sites of exclusion. In their perspective, far from serving simply to block or obstruct global flows, borders have become essential devices for their articulation. In so doing, borders have not just proliferated. Furthermore, they contend borders are also undergoing complex transformations. Indeed, they follow Saskia Sassen in claiming that borders are being disaggregated, both actually as well as heuristically. Mazzadra and Nielsen thus speak not only of a proliferation, but also of a heterogenization of borders. To this end, they argue that the multiple legal and cultural, social, and economic components of the concept and institution of the border tend to tear apart from the magnetic line corresponding to the geopolitical line of separation between nation states. Moreover, they emphasize that migration control has only quite recently become a prominent function of political borders. And they insist in a manner not altogether dissimilar from the argument advanced by Brown that today borders are not merely geographical margins or territorial edges. They are complex social institutions which are marked by tensions between practices of border reinforcement and border crossing. According to Mazzadra and Nielsen, only by bringing into focus this dual nature of border practices, of border reinforcement and border crossing, can we come to comprehend the crucial role that borders play in producing the times and spaces of global capitalism, as well as in shaping the struggles that rise up within and against these times and spaces, struggles that often allude problematically but in rich and determinate ways to the abolition of borders themselves. Borders and violence. Which brings us to the subject of violence. Mazadra and Nielsen stress that even as borders are, on the one hand, becoming finely tuned instruments for managing, calibrating, and governing global passages of people, money, and things, they are, on the other hand, simultaneously spaces in which the transformations of sovereign power and the ambivalent nexus of politics and violence are never far from view. Mazadra has elsewhere sought to expand the model of war to the study of the violent processes of control and suppression which target illegal migrations and also affect asylum seekers, in particular at the outer borders of the so-called Schengen space. His work attempts to show the political function of the border in a world of rapidly expanding exploitation of nomadic labor force, which is also a world of endemic violence or overt wars, in particular in the South, through either internal conflicts or external interventions where they add to the insecurity and the uprooting of entire populations. It furthermore aims to show what kind of uncontrollable social and juridical consequences this expansion of the model of war, or police in the form of war, is now producing for Europe. What's more, Mazadra's description of the border war of Europe does not only refer to statistics of the permanent increase of death, it also brings into view the contradictory effects of the violent security policies waged in the name of Europe by the bordering countries, now aggravated by the conjuncture of the global war on terror. The border war in Europe, Mazadra contends, is not really about stopping the flow of migrants. There is indeed no question of suppressing the flow of migrants towards Europe. Rather, it is about the propagation of fear. The new proletarians, in the original sense adopted by Marx, these are workers without a social status or recognition, must be transformed into subjects and objects of fear, experiencing fear of being rejected and eliminated, and inspiring fear in the stable populations. A similar sentiment has been echoed by Mbembe, in whose judgment, borders are no longer merely lines of demarcation separating distinct sovereign entities. Increasingly, they are the name we should use to describe the organized violence that underpins both contemporary capitalism and our world order in general. The border is no longer just a particular point in space, but both a technology and the moving body of undesired masses of population. Indeed, somewhat differently from Mazadra, Mbembe argues that rather than speak of borders per se, it is in fact more exact, more precise to speak of borderization, by which he means the process by which certain spaces are transformed into uncrossable places for certain classes of populations. Such classes, he continues, undergo a process of racialization, a process that is structurally violent. Transforming certain spaces into uncrossable places for certain classes of people entails rendering these spaces as places where speed must be disabled and the lives of a multitude of people judged to be undesirable or meant to be immobilized, if not shattered. Mbembe emphasizes the way in which technological innovations have transformed the border, their acceleration facilitating the creation of a segmented planet of multiple speed regimes. In this respect, Mbembe's argument converges with the work of Gabriel Popescu, who has highlighted how governments have begun embedding their regulatory functions in various networks of global flows with the help of digital technologies, thereby dislocating linear border functions and pushing them both outward into other states, territories, and inwards into national societies. At the same time, Popescu notes, bordering practices have been digitized through the automation of data collection in databases and data analysis. Such developments have rendered borders mobile and portable, thus opening up the entire space of the globe to potential bordering processes. In a word, according to Popescu, there has been an increase in bordering instances as people can encounter borders in various forms in a multitude of locales within their daily lives. Moreover, the nature of an individual's encounter with borders has changed, since this is often mediated via diverse digital devices and managed by private actors. At the same time, border control has become more individualized, as digitization allows surveillance to zero in on the smallest spaces, such as the body, and continuously monitor them. And finally, border security practices have taken a keen interest in the connection between the human body and identity as a means of achieving detailed control over the territoriality of movement. In the digital world of databases, the body achieves spatial co-presence, resulting in non-homogeneous geographies. The algorithms querying biometric data fragment the body and then recompose it in databases across space. These are precisely the kinds of technological innovations about which Mbembe also speaks, and which are embedded and employed in contemporary migration regimes, which Mbembe insists are aimed either at slowing down the dynamics of people's interactions, at creating distance, or at shattering the chains of relations between them so as to institute new patterns of separation. Nor are restrictions on movement limited to national boundaries. Instead, they are at work on effectively deepening the space and time asymmetries between different categories of humanity, while leading to the progressive ghettoization of entire regions of the world. Indeed, most provocatively, Mbembe concludes that to a large extent, this process is akin to a universalization of the Israeli model. In sum, Mbembe surmises quite dramatically that borders are meant to concretize the principle of dissimilarity rather than that of affinity. They are not only obstacles to free movement, they are boundaries between species and varieties of the human. As such, they play a crucial role in contemporary modes of production of human difference and relatedness. Human bodies are increasingly divided between those that matter and those that do not, those who can move and those who cannot or should only move under very strict conditions. Bodies that should not move are those that are uninsured. They must be tracked, captured, and dispensed of. Such bodies are kept shifting between invisibility, waiting, and effacement. They are trapped in fragmented spaces, stretched time, and indefinite waiting. So too have other activists and scholars emphasized the role of violence in relation to borders. Hatred, anger, and exploitation are the prominent features of this landscape, wrote Gloria Ansaldúa over 30 years ago in describing the background for the emergence of what she called the new mestiza in her classic Borderlands La Frontera, the new mestiza. Likewise, Harsha Walia has insisted in her 2013 book titled Undoing Border Imperialism that Western governance in particular and statehood is constituted through multiple modes, including the primacy of the border that delineates and reproduces territorial, political, economic, cultural, and social control. To this end, Walia quotes Alessandra Montezuma and Mike Davis, who write, "All borders are acts of state violence inscribed in landscape." We will return to explore the contours of Walia's thesis about border imperialism below. But first, let us mention the work of Rhys Jones, whose 2016 book titled Violent Borders, Refugees, and the Right to Move not only emphasizes the role of violence at the borders, but also links the emphasis to a critique of Wendy Brown's argument about waning sovereignty. In the book, Jones contends that the existence of the border itself produces the violence that surrounds it. To this end, he argues that the border creates the economic and jurisdictional discontinuities that have come to be seen as its hallmarks, providing an impetus for the movement of people, goods, drugs, weapons, and money across it. Furthermore, he stresses the hardening of the border over recent years, a hardening achieved through new security practices that he interprets as the source of the violence, not a response to it. In emphasizing the violence of borders, Jones operates with a nuanced definition of violence that encompasses not only overt, but also more covert structural forms. By honing in on the violence, Jones seeks expressly to counter the argument made by Brown, among others, that globalization is undermining the position of the state. To the contrary, Jones contends, the global scale of border violence demonstrates that the state remains the dominant container of political power in the world. Jones perhaps makes too much of his differences with Brown, for he is, after all, willing to acknowledge a reorientation of the role of the state in the global economic system, as the older system of borders and sovereign states is challenged by the cross-border movements of capital, goods, and people. Indeed, he explicitly recognizes that, quote, regional trade groups like the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, supranational institutions like the European Union, global organizations like the United Nations, World Trade Organization, and International Monetary Fund, global corporations, non-state militant groups, and terrorist organizations are all vying for power in the global system and operating through and around the borders of the traditional state. Nevertheless, he rather vehemently denies the notion that such developments have led to a decline in state power. To the contrary, he insists they have led to a reassertion of it, specifically through the construction of walls, fences, and other security apparatus at the border. Thus, as the movements of people threaten their ability to control resources and populations, states around the world have responded by hardening borders and violently enforcing their authority. The hardening of borders represents a rearticulation and expansion, not a retreat of state power. To help render this claim about the rearticulation and expansion of state power in relation to the border plausible, Jones highlights the increased cooperation between states in the management of their borders. He notes that most borders have ceased to be lines of dispute between states competing for control over territory, despite exceptions, such as the situation on the Korean Peninsula, between Russia and the Ukraine, and on the line of control in Kashmir. At most borders, At most borders, however, conflict has been replaced with cooperation as neighboring states work together against shared threats to their sovereign control over their territories. Such increased collaboration between states, Jones insists, has allowed them to retain their central role in the control of political space. Not only do states work together at the UN to recognize each other's sovereignty and reject secessionist and independence movements, so too do they work together at borders to manage and regulate, to make legible to each other people who do not acknowledge the state's exclusive rights to control their territory, migrants, smugglers, terrorists. And he goes on to mention many examples of these cross-border partnerships against shared threats. Like Mbembe and to some extent Mizadra, Jones hones in on the relationship between border violence and the restriction of movement. But more explicitly than others, Jones is concerned not only to trace recent transformations, but to detect longer-term continuities in the processes he observes at work at the borders today. Indeed, he takes the long view that movement restrictions at borders today are part of a long-term effort to control the movement of the poor, which has its roots in slavery, vagrancy, and poor laws. At times, in fact, Jones proves willing to trace the roots of such restrictions further back still, such as when he claims that, quote, restrictions on movements at borders are part of a long-term conflict between states and people who move, a conflict that goes back to the earliest states and human settlements. While the regulation of movement takes different forms through various historical periods, the underlying desire to protect privileges accrued through the control of resources and opportunities remains the same. At his boldest, Jones thus claims to have deciphered the very same motivation, expressed albeit in different forms across different historical periods, namely the desire to restrict the movement of the poor on the part of the powerful and the privileged. To put the point again in his words, the true source of the crisis is that movement restrictions at borders continue to allow states to contain the poor and protect the wealth and privilege of their populations. In striking contrast to Mbembe, however, Jones has little to say about processes of racialization at work. This despite the fact that, as Harsha Walia has argued, the reinforcement of physical and psychological borders against racialized bodies has been a key instrument through which the sanctity and myth of superiority of Western civilization has been produced and reproduced. And with that, I think we shall pause again.